said 30 seconds, so. Well, good, snowy, blustery, almost spring Thursday evening. Keep in mind, almost spring. Thank you for coming tonight, to all of you, and for those that are going to watch this as it's videotaped, thank you for watching it. And my name is Colleen Feige. I'm the president of the League of Women Voters of Edina, and it's my pleasure to welcome you to hear about the ERA, what it is. Probably know that now, and why it's important still. And it's my pleasure to introduce to you Kathryn Ringham. I somehow got Ringwald in there, sorry. Ringham, who is on the executive board of ERA Minnesota, and she'll be speaking first. And also Pat Reisenger is with the ERA Minnesota as well. So it's been going on for 100 years, trying to get ERA passed, but we're going to make it some point. Thank you very much, Kathryn.
You're welcome. So should I use this one or four?
You can use four.
Yeah.
Yep.
Okay, great. Well, welcome to ERA 101. My name, as Colleen so nicely mentioned, is Kathryn Ringham. I have been on the ERA Minnesota Executive Committee for about the last 4 years or so. But like many of you, as a feminist, I've been supportive of and watching and observing and the ups and downs of the ERA over the last decades. How many of you have also been in that spot of watching and observing the ERA go up and down and around and around? Yeah. Pat and I are wearing a little bit of the green tonight, not only because green is the color of the ERA, but also in recognition of St. Patrick's Day tomorrow. So happy St. Patrick's Day, and it's St. Uru's Day, so we complimented the lavender shaded hair there, which is the color of St. Uru's Day. So number one, thank you for your interest tonight in learning about the ERA and getting an update and what you can do to support and help it along its way. We have to give a quick thanks to the Maine ERA for, and give credit to them for largely putting together this PowerPoint, but just know that a lot of other states are in the same process of Minnesota, and so we're sharing some of the materials. And a huge thank you to the League of Women Voters as an organization, as an incredible partner, and we just so appreciate your support, and now more than ever, we really appreciate your support. ERA was founded by a woman named Betty Folliard in 2014. It was to advocate for adding the Equal Rights Amendment to not only the U.S. Constitution, but our state constitution as well. ERA Minnesota is united with 400 other equal rights organizations, business supporters, and also our partners, our lead partners in two major national ERA organizations. And as Colleen mentioned, it's important to note that this is the 100th year that the ERA was first introduced to Congress, and March is also Women's History Month. Women's History Month started off as one day, the Women's Equality Day on March 8th. Then in 1981, it became a week. And then in 1995, it became a month. But I'm sure I join with all of you and note that the contributions made by women need to be celebrated and acknowledged every day, because we feel that women should be included in our history and all rooms where decisions should be made, and in our founding document, our Constitution. And most people don't know the full story about the ERA, so that's why Pat and I are here to tell you about the ERA and, more importantly, why it still matters. Now, Pat and I have never done a presentation before, so just want to mention that we may not know all the answers, and we may not may have to read a little bit more from the script, but we are passionate about passing the ERA, and that counts for a lot more, probably. So tonight, we are going to cover these points. I'm going to begin with the first two bullets, and then Pat is going to do the next three, and then we're going to share with the ending, highlighting steps to help carry the ERA over the finish line this year. Okay. This is a photo of Lady Justice on the top outside of our U.S. Supreme Court building in Washington, D.C. The Constitution she defends on the inside of the building is the ultimate law of the land in the U.S. We all know we all should know what is included, and moreover what's not included in our foundational legal documents. The U.S. Constitution started off by saying, we the people, but not all people were included in this important document. And as we all know, unequal treatment and long-term patterns of bias still exist. Moreover, we're the only nation, only developed nation that does not have equal legal rights clearly stated in the written Constitution that make it absolutely clear that all people should be treated legally equally. And every constitution in the world that's been written since the end of World War II contains a sex equality clause, but not in the U.S. And how can we be a beacon of light to the world until we address equal justice under the law? Okay, the next slide. So what is the ERA amendment? I'm sure many of you are familiar, but now there are some different versions of it floating around. What's important to note about the ERA is that most people, most Americans, think that we already have a version of the ERA, and that it passed sometime in the last century, but of course they're all mistaken. In 2016, the ERA Coalition did a national poll and revealed that, yes, 80% of people think it's already there. 94% of the people polled, however, said that they thought we should have an ERA or a like thing in our Constitution. And this extraordinary level of support, it was expressed by both men and women. 90% of men and 96% of women agree that that should be in. And when identified by political party, Democrats, Republicans, and Independents, it followed along too. 97% of Democrats, 90% of Republicans, and 92% of Independents think there should be an ERA in the Constitution. The ERA is how our founding documents will catch up with where we should have moved as a democracy, giving half the population the rights and protections that have never been clearly laid out in the Constitution. So Pat and I will be talking about two constitutions, the U.S. Constitution and the Constitution in the state of Minnesota, which neither one includes the word woman in or gives full protections. And these are the 24 words of the federal ERA, and these are the words from 1972. On this slide, we can see the all new and more inclusive language that's in the proposal for the ERA for the state of Minnesota Constitution. And this version of the ERA was passed just last year in the state of Nevada with a 58% approval rate. And in January, the New York State passed that had to go through 2 years of legislatures, but it passed, and their version of the ERA, which is even more inclusive than this one, and that it includes pregnancy protections, is going to be on their ballot on 2024, which is what our goal is too, is to have this on the ballot and have the people vote for whether they want this or not. And we feel pretty confident that this expanded language for Minnesota will resonate, as the wording is similar to what's in the Minnesota Human Rights Act, which currently prohibits discrimination in our society based on protected class such as race, religion, disability, national origin, sex, marital status, familial status, education, sexual orientation, and gender identity. The bottom line is that laws can easily be changed, but a constitutional amendment is not as easily changed. So that's what needs to change to make this more permanent. It also helps to look back a little bit on the history of the ERA, just to kind of refresh our memories. Sadly, the work and the time and effort put into the passage of the 19th Amendment is kind of being mimicked today. They each took around 100 years to make it happen, and the twists and turns and the ups and downs are all around us with this issue. It's such a simple thing when you think about it, those 24 original words, but somehow it's gotten more complicated over time. So looking back, English common law was the law of the land for the early settlers, the founders and the authors of the Constitution. For women, it meant being covered by their fathers, brothers, husbands, and even sons. A married woman was a femme couvert who could not own property, make contracts, etc. And single women and girls were dependent for their civil rights on male relatives. Moving on to colonial women, were well aware of the injustice of fighting for independence and yet not receiving their own equality of rights. We all may remember the words of Abigail Adams, who said to her husband to remember the ladies as he went off to help write the Constitution. And we also know that he really, really failed to do that. The U.S. Constitution was written for white men of property, leaving out women, slaves, Native Americans, and the poor by custom did not hold equal place to white male citizens in our new country. And by the mid-1880s or 1800s, women's suffrage and abolition of slavery were closely linked. In fact, the women and African slaves were excluded from full citizenship. So suffragettes and abolitionists came together in a mutual cause to expand all voting rights. On the left is Frederick Douglass, the extraordinary voice for abolition and slavery and for freedom from race discrimination. And on the right, of course, is Susan B. Anthony, who was the voice for rights of women, and particularly the right for women to vote. They were friends. They both lobbied in Congress prior to the Civil War. But the debates that occurred over the 14th and 15th Amendments nearly tore apart the fragile peace of the nation following the Civil War. Douglass, who was really quite a feminist, had to choose between the rights for freed black men or women, and he chose the former. He felt he had to do that in order for anything to pass at all. It was a compromise he made. And it was quite clear at that time, and still is, that in the text of the amendment of the 14th Amendment was not included to include women in the Equal Protection Clause. And just for reference, the 13th Amendment involved the end of slavery. The 14th Amendment was on behalf of the rights of former slave men, or the Equal Protection Clause, and it was the first time that the word male was in the Constitution. And the 15th Amendment was the right of former slave men to vote. So that leads us to kind of the struggle then, because the defeat of women's rights in those two amendments really was a crushing defeat for the women's movement at that time. And it was hard enough to get the votes for free slaves to get their rights, and apparently it was just too much to ask for the vote for women, much less full equality for women. So for the next 50 years, women fought for the right to vote, for representation in a country that called itself a democracy. It became really an ugly battle in every state, with lots of battles and a lot of states voting it down. So it was a major struggle. But finally, in 1917, women became the first picketers at the White House. That was a brand new way of getting the word out to the public about this particular issue. And the 19th Amendment then passed Congress during World War I, and its ratification was a close battle, particularly in the state of Tennessee. And on the table out there, I brought 3 books, one of which is called The Women's Hour. by Elaine Weiss, and I recommend you read it. There's 2 other books written by lawyers that also kind of tell the tale of getting women the vote, and I think there's a movie or 2 out there too, but all highly recommended. It was very dramatic, kind of photo finish for the ERA in Tennessee. So finally, the vote for women came, and it was fully ratified. It was the first and only mention of women in our U.S. Constitution. But let's be clear that just because women got the vote, it wasn't for all women, because Native American women still couldn't vote. Jim Crow was had reduced African American voting, particularly in the South, but also in the North. And for Latina and for every other culture besides white women, it was delayed, in fact, up till 1965 in 1972 for another group of women. So it took a long time to get full voting rights for all women. The suffrage also brought the roles and rights of women into full view. The inequities were obvious to those who cared to look. The women activists who brought about this enormous change turned then to getting full equality rights, which was kind of their next step. And now that the vote was at least on paper legal, what about all the aspects of being equal in America? So on the heels of the 19th Amendment in 1923, Alice Paul, who's featured there, and a woman named Crystal Eastman wrote what would become the Equal Rights Amendment. And the language they use actually mirrors the 19th Amendment. They just substituted a word vote for the new one. Alice Paul is a very interesting person. How many of you know or have heard of Alice Paul? Looks like a few of you, yes. She was a young suffragist. She studied law, traveled to England, and learned from the Pankhursts in England on how to protest loudly and proudly. And when she returned to the U.S., she brought all of that information going forward and then got a PhD in sociology. So she was very, very smart woman. And when she came back to the U.S., she was the one who started the picketing at the White House, and where they stood in silence with placards. And as we all know, many of them were sent to prison many times over that period of time. But after the 19th Amendment did pass and was ratified, then she turned her attention to writing what would give women full equality, the Equal Rights Amendment, which just said, equality of rights under the law shall not be abridged by the U.S. or any other state on account of sex. So, and that's really stood up well over time. So then the years of marching began. Putting equal rights for women in the spotlight brought out the deeply held bias about women's place in society. That bias was at the core of a lack of representation for women in government, laws, courts, schools, in work, and really in all aspects of life. The ERA challenged those inequities and continued to do so along with the marching for, guess what, 50 years. And then in 1972, after the bipartisan vote passed both houses of Congress and 35 states, including Minnesota, in 1973, quickly ratified, the ratification process stalled, and there was enough opposition from the southern states to stop ratification. And those states that were really blocking the 19th Amendment are many of the same states that also really blocked the ERA going forward. The congressional deadline, as many of you know, was an extended 3 years to 1982. But then it passed with still 35 states, and we needed 38. So a lot of people thought it was over at that time. And that was another crushing blow for the effort. So bringing us more up to today, the proposed amendment, one of the particularities about it is that the deadline or those time limits were put into the preamble and not the text. So there is an effort, and Congress has the power actually to change that if they would. And a lot of amendments don't have any deadlines. A lot of people think it was a sexist move to do this. There was the 27th Amendment Amendment passed in the 90s after 202 years. So there's lots of precedents for and legal entanglements around some of these particular issues, but the deadline, and there's a resolution nationally to change that. But we believe that human rights have no expiration dates, and there's nothing in the Constitution that allows for deadlines on amendments. So there's some flexibility there. And of course, who remembers Phyllis Schlafly, the Eagle Forum, the Stop ERA campaign, which was an acronym for Stop Taking Our Privileges. The opposition to the ERA held deeply embedded views that the proper place for a woman was to remain at home, not requiring equality because she was under the protection of her husband or father, etc. And conservative white Christian politics and corporate interest are blamed for creating a hostile environment for women's issues that would last more decades. And over the course of the last century, the ERA was supported by every Republican U.S. president and their wives all the way up to Ronald Reagan. In 1940, the Republican Party was the first party to adopt the ERA into its national platform, and Democrats added it in 1944. So it's very clearly a bipartisan issue and should be. And now, 40 years later, the Eagle Forum is still around, believe it or not. Her daughter has taken it over. But it's hard to believe that we were still arguing about shared bathrooms, women in the military, and same-sex marriages, and yet that's what stopped the ERA in the 80s. So now we're going to turn it over to even more current information with Pat.
That's been quite a whirlwind through history, hasn't it? And here we are, 50 years later, yes, 50 years later, after Congress passed this, and 40 years later since good old Phyllis Schlafly, and we're still talking about what now? Why are we still working to get this passed? So something that Kathryn mentioned earlier, I want to emphasize again. Laws can be changed. Acts can be removed. Amendments to the Constitution are, yes, difficult to get through, but they're also very difficult to remove. In our history, I think I'm correct in saying that the only amendment that's ever been revoked was the good old 18th, revoked by the 21st. How many remember that one? Prohibition, okay? An amendment to the Constitution was revoked. It took quite some doing, it took quite some years, but amendments stand the test of time. So what we want to talk a little bit about now, why we still need to work for the ERA, because we don't have those equal protections under the law. There are a number of key issues involved in why we are still working to bring the ERA into law, and some of those issues we're going to go into a little more depth. They include the gender pay gap, sexual harassment and sexual discrimination in the workplace, sexual violence, unequal access to health care in spite of the ACA. The COVID pandemic has really shone a light on, what shall we say, on the biases and the differences in the workplace for women. Women, by and large, were affected much more severely by the COVID pandemic in terms of access to jobs, keeping their jobs, and pay in their jobs. There are multiple reasons for this, and we can talk a little bit more about that. Another reason for the push right now is, as you well know, last year, Roe was overturned. That will have lasting effects. So let's go a little more in depth. For many of you, I would guess, like myself, what brought me to working, brought my awareness to the need for the Equal Rights Amendment to be reinvigorated, had to do with gender pay gap. How many of you have experienced, in some form or another, a gap, a discrimination, etc.? We all have stories, and maybe a little bit later we can share some of those stories. Those stories are important. They're a lot of the reason that some of us come to this work in the first place, but they're not the only reason. We have become much more inclusive in our attempts to bring equality under the law. The statistics that you'll see in these next few slides, I think almost exclusively come from the Pew Foundation. One or two of them probably come from the ERA Coalition, and then I think there might be some polling information that comes from the AP. I have that in the notes if you would like those references. Okay, but let's take a look at this. In 2022, this is the equity pay issue. In 2022, a white woman made, on average, 82 cents to the dollar of a white man's comparable work. Okay? What struck me about this was this hasn't changed. For the most part, that number has not changed in 20 years. The history behind that is that back in 1960, that average number was 60 cents or 61 cents on the dollar, women earnings compared to men's. And here we are in 2020 and 2022, and we're still significantly below in the earnings arena. What will it take? It'll take the ERA to change that. Women, other than white women, so we're talking about black women, Latina, and other culturally disadvantaged women are making far less than that 82% that white women are making. Most of the women, the majority of women in the workforce who are earning those lower wages, most of the people who are earning those lower wages are women. It's something like 60%, and it may very well have increased in the past couple of years. One of the concerns across the board is that those low-wage earners are frequently heads of households. It's something in the area of 24% of households are headed by single women, who the majority of whom are making lower wages. There are unequal pay issues and sexual discrimination issues in the workplace, and they are majority involving women. There are a number of laws on the books that are supposed to cover some of these issues, and some of those laws include the Equal Pay Act of 1963, which does prohibit discrimination based on sex, but it is not enforced, as we well know. Title VII of the Civil Rights Act is also supposed to prohibit discrimination in the workplace based on color, religion, or race. National origin as well, but it does not specifically pertain to women. You probably know the Title VII and the sports and the advantages for women and et cetera. The Lilly Ledbetter Act of 2009 was a very interesting play it was an interesting effort to reduce recriminations against people, against women in particular, who were asserting that they were being paid unequally. And they were making these assertions based on knowledge of other persons' wages. There were recriminations in the workplace. That's part of my story. And the Lilly Ledbetter Act was meant to help remove those recriminations and also to allow, more importantly, to allow a person who felt or who experienced that discrimination to, in fact, file suit, file a complaint. There was a time limit up until Lilly Ledbetter Act, and that time limit was very short. The Ledbetter Act changed that time limit, which allows us to now file suits for discrimination that's occurred over years rather than over months. There's also a proposal for a Fair Paycheck Act. It has not been passed. It's probably dying a slow death. But all of these laws that I just mentioned have been written and enacted as a means of patching up, of repairing the damage that continues to be done because we do not have the force of law behind anti-discrimination actions. When it comes to Minnesota, I checked on some interesting facts today. In Minnesota, the pay gap is fairly broad, as it is in many of our states. In Minnesota, I believe this figure, the 2019 census data, the average man in Minnesota had an income of $60,500. whereas the average woman in Minnesota, comparable workforce we're talking about, the average woman made $49,000. That's a pay gap of about $11,000 per year. Add that up over your working life, and that's quite a chunk of change. So that's the gender pay gap. The second on that original slide talks about, oops. There we go. The second item on the why are we working on this now, why are we still hammering away at it, has to do with sexual harassment in the workplace and sexual discrimination in the workplace. We all know that women make up more than half of the workforce at this point in time, and yet over 50% of our young people tell us that they have experienced some kind of harassment in the workplace. Over 50%. It's a very different world now than it was in 1923 when the ERA language was first created. Since that time, women have entered the workplace in large numbers. We are heads of households. And being a head of household has a clear economic impact on our society. When it comes to sexual discrimination in the workplace, which impacts women in greater numbers, of course, than men, one of the biggest issues that we have to contend with, and that the ERA will help us address, is the issue of pregnancy and the workplace, and whether or not jobs are held, whether or not paternity, maternity leave, family leave is what we're calling it, is in fact honored, and whether or not it's required. At this point in time, it is not required anywhere in the United States other than certain very specific job places. We have a couple of laws on the books, acts on the books, meant to address violence in the workplace, violence against women, and yet they do not have the teeth, they do not have the force in them that the Equal Rights Amendment will give us. One of those is, you're probably familiar with the Violence Against Women Act of 1994. It took quite some doing to get that reenacted just last year. And there were great arguments against renewing the Violence Against Women Act, if you can believe that. Some of the arguments are complicated. They have to do with how violence is addressed in the Constitution. The only place that violence, sexual violence of any kind, is addressed is in, believe it or not, the Commerce Clause of the Constitution, which is the grounds on which the Supreme Court had issues with the Violence Against Women Act. There's no current force against to sue an attacker because of wording in the Commerce Clause. Okay, if a woman is raped and attempts to file suit, there are two efforts, of course. There's the criminal prosecution, and then there's a civil action that some women have attempted to pursue. The Supreme Court found recently that that isn't covered by constitutional language, and the language they were citing was that language in the Commerce Clause. That was in 2022. Another issue that we're still working to rectify is equal access to health care. Okay, the Affordable Care Act, we thought, was based on equal access to health care, equal premium rates, equal care, equal costs. It is not. In fact, There are provisions in the ACA. Let me find my notes. There are provisions that allow for discrimination in certain cases in the ACA. Family planning and pregnancy was a big issue for coverage, contraception, etc. under the ACA. It is still debated. It is still argued. It is still not equitably distributed or accessed. Abortion rights, we know from Roe being overturned this past year that equal health care access is being denied across the states. Whoops. Sorry. So 100 years later, 50 years later, we are still trying to enact this amendment to the Constitution. There are still discussions, there are still court cases, there are still arguments for passing the Equal Rights Amendment, and there are arguments against it. I think it's my cosmic, there we go, okay. So some of the arguments. One thing to remember before we even talk about those arguments. The equal rights movement for many decades was primarily carried by the Republican Party, okay, through the 1940s. And the Democratic Party eventually came along, and it became a bipartisan issue. It became a very working middle class issue. Come the 1980s with Ronald Reagan, that changed. We're aware of that. But the history is that it has been a bipartisan issue. There are ups and downs to who's carrying the banner, but by and large, right now, the Democrats are carrying that banner. The arguments that we talk about when we engage in conversation with folks for and against passing the Equal Rights Amendment include this one. When you bring up the issue of protection against sex discrimination, one of the arguments will frequently be, we've already got the 14th Amendment. But the 14th Amendment actually has not upheld when it comes to arguments for sexual discrimination. And we can see that in the change from the Earl Warren's Court of the 1950s and 60s to the change in the Supreme Court that we call the John Roberts Court, which became a much more dogmatic, called the originalist interpretation of the Constitution. In the 14th Amendment, women are not mentioned, and so the originalists prefer to go with what's in the Constitution. What did the Founding Fathers intend? And if the Founding Fathers didn't intend to include women in the Constitution, then why should the Supreme Court consider it? Right. So the philosophy of the court has obviously changed. The majority of today's court are members of the Federalist Society, which bind themselves to that original intent, and their attitude towards women's civil rights harken back to what is in the original Constitution. So it's clear that the 14th Amendment itself is not likely to cover women if the Supreme Court members do not find that terminology in our Constitution. There's also no provision in the original Constitution. Two of our justices, who were to some degree on opposite ends of the spectrum when it comes to women's rights, are Ruth Bader Ginsburg and Antonin Scalia. One more conservative, one more liberal, and yet they both agreed that the Constitution does not, in fact, cover women, does not cover discrimination based on sex. That's why we need to keep working. Another argument that you may very well have heard by now is that there are lots of laws. We've got plenty of protection for women. We've got plenty of protection for all of those groups who are not covered under the Constitution, who are not mentioned in the Constitution. Kathryn mentioned to us earlier that laws can be changed. Laws may, on paper, prohibit sexual discrimination, and yet the full force of the courts is not used. They lack clear constitutional direction to do so. There are loopholes in laws, as we all know. Enforcement in the area of sexual discrimination has been historically quite weak. Laws can be changed. Laws can be repealed. We said earlier, it's a different story when it comes to amendments, making them and changing them. Some of the acts that we're referencing here include the Equal Pay Act. Sex is not included. It does not have the importance of race, religion, and et cetera that are mentioned by word, are mentioned in the Equal Pay Act. The Civil Rights Act. Sex discrimination was added to the Civil Rights Act at the very last minute, and it was in an attempt to have it not pass by the southern states. The Violence Against Women Act that we mentioned earlier, 1994, lost in a Supreme Court challenge. And the Affordable Care Act, which we've already mentioned, prohibits unfair gender rating for premiums and compels coverage of contraception by insurance companies, but we know that that's always under attack. Another argument. And these are the important arguments. Let's not forget that there are other arguments or disputes about passing the Equal Rights Amendment. Some of them we would now think quite trivial. Sharing bathrooms, same-sex marriage. All of those arguments have come and gone. Some of those situations have come to pass, and believe it or not, the American family has not disappeared. Society has not crumbled. We are still here. Some of the other arguments that are a little bit more serious to deal with, it's this one in particular, that the ERA would expand abortion rights. We have records that show that the equal rights amendments that have passed in numerous states have not caused great expansion or any expansion of access or situations concerning abortion. An important note here is that the ERA is meant to prohibit sexual discrimination. It means that in the same instance, we must treat men and women equally. It does not mean that men and women are equal. They aren't. Women have abortions. Men do not have abortions. Abortion can be protected by laws or by constitutional amendments. We are hoping that an ERA amendment will protect that right. Just an aside, the latest Pew Charitable Trust polling showed that 60% of Americans do favor having legal abortions in some or all cases. Here's my favorite argument. If we have an equal rights amendment, women could get drafted. We would have women in combat. This is an old passé argument, folks. Women are in combat. And the military still works. The bigger issue now in the military is not the notion of women in combat. We already know it's a fact. We are all still here. The bigger issue is whether or not women in the military are being treated fairly. Do they have access to the promotions? Do they have the speed of promotions in the system? It's a very, very defined system. Are their family benefits equivalent, or are they fair, is the bigger question these days. So those are some of the bigger arguments and also some of those littler arguments. The question is, why now? Why after 50 years? Why 40 years after Phyllis Schlafly are we still trying to get this amendment passed? The biggest reason for that is that because our Constitution does not cover sex discrimination in any way, shape, or form. Women are not mentioned in our Constitution. We all have friends, we all have family members. We are women, we know women, we love women. It's time now, 100 years after 1923 Seneca Falls, to get this done. It's time after 1972, 50 years, to get it done. The arguments against it are one by each slowly falling away. So let's look at some of the current situation. When it comes to the federal ERA, and remember this was the simpler language, these are the states in pink that ratified when Congress passed back in the 70s. So of course you see that Minnesota, as Kathryn mentioned earlier, ratified back in 1973. The pattern here is clear that the southern states are lagging behind in ratifying. We've got a couple of states that have, the last state to ratify was Nevada, and that counted for number 38, which is what brought the argument back to the fore. I think Kathryn did mention that New York State is bringing, oh, I'm sorry, that's at the state level. Let me go on to the next slide. Okay. At the state level, I hope you can see these colors clearly. You can see that Minnesota, Nevada, which just passed, New York, Vermont, and Maine are all states working toward their state-level constitutional amendments. Why do we need it here in Minnesota? Why is Minnesota working so hard to get this passed? We are looking for guarantees that equal rights will be afforded to all citizens, all American citizens, certainly all citizens of the state of Minnesota, regardless of sex. We need legal remedies against sexual discrimination, and we need to send a strong message to the country, to Congress, that the Constitution will not have tolerance for sexual discrimination. That's what states, one by each, passing their state-level amendments will help us do. At the federal level, this is a frightening statistic. The United States is the only developed nation out of 187 members in the UN that does not have equal protection for women. The only one of 187. So what are we doing about it? Well, we're here tonight. The ERA Minnesota group is working hard to educate, to organize, and to advocate. We are building a network of supporters for this Equal Rights Amendment. We are looking for your support. We have a sign-up sheet outside. We would love to welcome you into the fold. The Equal Rights Amendment Minnesota Working Group interviews and certifies candidates for election here in the state of Minnesota as to their positions on the ERA. And we are working hard to keep our legislators aware of the support in the state for the Equal Rights Amendment. It is in front of our state legislature at the moment. These are the bills that are currently being entertained, and I use that term lightly. So in the Minnesota House, we have two bills. One addresses the need for a constitutional amendment in the state of Minnesota. One addresses the need for the U.S. Congress to adopt the Equal Rights Amendment as passed. Our hope is that this year these bills will come to the floor of the House to be passed on to become a ballot issue in 2024. We're getting there. I'll have another slide with an update in just a minute. In the Minnesota Senate, we have 2 bills, parallel bills. Again, we are looking for a floor vote. What is the status of these bills at the moment? I hope you can see this. This is our Minnesota Senate, okay? The Senate has already passed out of committee, and that's a necessary requirement. The federal bill. So from Minnesota to the U.S. Congress, we have the invitation to get the ERA as ratified by the 38 states into the archives and therefore to become law. The Senate, it's really hard to see that, isn't it? Okay, that top line with the circles as opposed to the rectangles, those are the 2 committees that the state level amendment have passed through already. Okay. We don't know what happens next. We are hoping that particular bill will go to the floor for a vote, which means it then goes to become a ballot issue. But we don't know what might happen next. And then this is what's happening in the House, all right? The House is still a little more up in the air as far as where do we go next. I have some notes here in the House. The next committee hearing that the House File 173, which is the state level, the next committee that may go to is the Rules and Legislative Action Committee. That committee is headed by Representative Jamie Long, who is the DFL majority leader in the House. Every time the bill goes through another committee hearing, there are opportunities for amendments to it, there are opportunities for discussion, there are opportunities to stop it from getting to a House vote. We are hopeful that that will not happen, that this bill will continue to move through as it has been. This past March 8th, we had very good turnout. We had very positive movement of these 2 bills, both in the House and in the Senate. So what do? We don't just sit on our hands and wait to see what happens with these bills. There are some very specific things we can do and that we invite you to do with us. First of all, there is a sign-up sheet outside. Please sign up. If not for membership as an ERA Minnesota volunteer or worker, at least sign up to get our ERA news blasts. It'll keep you up to date on what's happening, and it will keep you informed as to what you might be able to do, invitations to come to rallies, and etc. Okay, there's our website. Quick and easy to get to, lots of information on there. Number 2 of what can you do, we all have friends. We have friends who are advocates for the ERA, and we have friends who may argue against it. Talk with them. Listen to them. Help them see the light. Okay, there's a lot of education that can be done in simple cup of coffee with a friend. I'm always surprised when I talk to other women who are not aware of the Equal Rights Amendment or are not as fine-tuned into the situation with discrimination in their workplace, and et cetera. So talk and listen. And then one of the most important things that any of us as citizens in a democracy can do is to make our voices heard. How do you do that when it comes to the Equal Rights Amendment? You blast off that little email to your legislator. You make that voicemail. They do listen. They do count them up. And if like my legislator, they do respond. I get personal responses when I send an email or leave a voicemail. Hi, Pat, I hear you. Thanks for the message. Yep, I know where you stand. I'm with you. Okay. Know who your legislators are. Go to, www.sos.state.mn.us. .mn.us.gov. Find out who your legislators are. Send them that quick email. Thank you. Thank you for coming out tonight. Thank you for listening, and let's have some conversation. Let's have a little interaction. Colleen's going to grab the microphone for questions or comments. Kathryn's going to come up, and we'll do our best.
Any questions?
Can you tell some stories? Let's hear what you've got to say.
She doesn't want to tell a story. She has a question.
I just wanted to say thank you very much for the presentation. This was very interesting. The Rules Committee very rarely changes the content of a bill. It's to see whether it's going to go to the floor. That's the next thing. So I don't think we have to worry about amendments at the Rules Committee. So it's a really hopeful sign that it's in the Rules Committee in both the Senate and the House. So I thought to want to put a positive spin on that. So
One of the challenges that's out there is apparently there is kind of a number limit on how many amendments can be put forward on a ballot. And we are aware that there's one connected to the lottery that is a mandatory one for 2024 already. But we've heard like there might be max of 2 or 3. So that really puts a big challenge in front of us, and Jamie Long needs a lot of pushing right now because he has alluded to the fact that there's at least 10, maybe 12 other possible, amendments that he has heard about or is starting to work with, and we keep saying, well, we waited 100 years, and the other huge thing is that 2020, if we pass it this year, it'll give us time, lots of time to gear up because we're going to need a major campaign on education and sharing what this is all about and getting the word out. Pat may have mentioned, but it's one of the amendments where unless you vote yes, it's counted as a no vote. So, if we're lucky enough or if it does go forward and it gets on the ballot, a lot of the education will be around educating people that have to vote yes, because if they either don't vote or vote no, it's counted against the ERA. So.
Any other questions or comments?
I hope I'm understanding this correctly. Can Minnesota be the first state to achieve something here? Like we did with same-sex marriage in 2012?
Yeah, no, there's 27 other states who already have went ahead, with the failure of the federal level, that they've gone ahead. And so there's more than half the states already have their own. So we're really behind. Oh. Yeah, we're dragging. It's embarrassing, frankly, that we don't have it on the state or federal level. Mm-hmm.
Thank you. Thank you for the presentation. I am harking back to the slide that talks about Frederick Douglass and Susan B. Anthony. And so I'm understanding from your presentation that there was a division between abolitionists and the suffrage movement over including women. But I also understand that when voting rights were passed, as you also pointed out, that there was exclusion. It passed with some political exchanges excluding the rights of non-white women to vote. What outreach has been made to communities of color and to BIPOC people, communities, to unify behind this proposed constitutional amendment?
Yeah, you want to answer that one?
And to be honest, I can't cite specific examples, but the fact that the Minnesota proposal for an amendment to our state constitution has become far more inclusive. It means for us at ERA Minnesota that we've got work to do exactly what you've just mentioned, Joni.
And I think, as I mentioned at the start, that this is we're building a coalition. We already have lots and lots of partners. A lot of them are from communities of color. Rise is an example. They had their women's convention last weekend. So I think we're totally aware as our country becomes more and more diverse, this is for everyone. And in fact, in the early days of the suffragette movements, there were a lot of really, really forward-thinking African American women involved. But for those who know their history well, unfortunately, the leaders in the suffragette movement put them at the back of parades. They were really mean, really mean. And looking back now, it's just awful. And we really lost the spirit of having a diverse coalition to a certain extent. But there always were people, that, I don't know if you remember the suffragettes parade, one of the big images is the woman on the white horse. She was a Native American heritage. So it really has had a history of diversity, and we're hoping that that's going to completely follow through because it's very, very important. Yeah, good question.
Kind of along similar lines, I wondered how would the federal legislation, I know Minnesota has a lot more specifics to cover all these other protected classes, but what about issues of non-gendered individuals? Does just saying sex, does that keep it not by discrimination of sex? Does that therefore cover not just men, women, and those who identify as non-binary?
Yeah, I think the thinking on that last year in Minnesota, there were actually two versions of the bill. One said the word sex, which was the original one and mimics the federal and, don't want to make waves. But we all acknowledge that society has changed. It's evolved. And so there was a second bill introduced last year that had the word gender in it. Oh, my God, gender. And that caused, some fracas. So when I saw the new version this year, I went, oh, my goodness, how is this going to go over? But it's turning out to really be a positive thing because I think as part of our coalition, all of those areas that were mentioned are now looking strongly at equality as well because we're all victims of discrimination at certain levels. So, but your question was about the federal level. Yeah, I think at the federal level, they just kept it as simple as possible. And I don't know long term, this whole thing is evolving and changing as we go forward. But, I think in Minnesota and the last two versions of the ERA passed at the state level were a lot more inclusive. So that's really the direction it's going towards.
So Kathryn and I were talking a little bit earlier about, so what happens if nothing happens this year, either federally or at the state level? And the discussion of starting over if nothing happens this year or if it's all voted down is kind of scary because if we have to start over, on the one hand, we're back to square one. On the other hand, if we start over, like Kathryn said, times have changed since that original wording in 1923. The question of including all groups because equal means equal, right? Maybe that is a step in the right direction. So there are arguments, on both sides. And I think the biggest one is that question of inclusivity and will that work at the federal level?
Mm-hmm. Any other questions? Or comments?
Yeah. We have buttons. If anyone wants a button, yeah, please take them. Or give them to your daughters or neighbors or mothers or aunts.
A comment. You said that 80% of the people that were polled don't realize that the ERA amendment has never been passed. It seems like that's something we could even be talking with our friends and neighbors about now, because if the 80%, some of our friends and neighbors don't know that, don't know it's not been passed. So that's something even now. And a comment you made about contact your legislators, whether they are on board or not, they need to hear, because they do keep count of, I've got 50% or 90% of the people that I represent that have contacted me know that that's the important thing, and that's important to them. And that's really important. The legislators always speak to that. Contact us, whether you're with us or against us, contact.
And I've even taken the extreme step of contacting legislators that I can't vote for.
Yeah.
Nobody
Yeah.
said I couldn't.
Especially if they're heads of a committee that it's being considered under, then, yeah. If they're the head of a committee that is considering this, that it has to pass through, that you do not need to be a constituent to contact them.
I have friends in your district.
Exactly. And I talk to them.
Yeah.
I talk to them, yes.
Exactly. And again, who is the person that we need to contact that is not representing any of us in this room?
Jamie Long.
Jamie Long. Okay.
Jamie Long would be number one, but you're right. Anyone and everyone on both sides of the fence. You know, it's such a simple thing. It's all about equality. It's as simple as that, and it should not be controversial. But somehow, it appears that it's hard to get it through. So. Yeah, any pushing. Never underestimate the value of those contacts. Email, phone, in person particularly is good. I know Paul and I are involved in a climate group, and one of our newer members spends a lot of time, I'm talking about Carla, at the legislatures, and she makes weekly appointments with her legislators to check in and talk with them, and then goes to the other side and just makes her voice heard, and she gets things done.
And the League of Women Voters does that same thing. We've got
Yes.
folks that are advocates.
Who's the Republican champion for ERA?
You know, I don't have that list in front of me.
No?
Yeah. We can get that information. I didn't bring my script here. But there is a healthy list. If you go to the website and put in that bill number, it lists all of and the one for getting it on the ballot, there's probably 20 co-sponsors. So there's a healthy crop. Yeah. Yeah.
That would
there's
be
many.
good to point out to your friends that this is a bipartisan issue.
Yeah. Lead with that. Yeah. Well, thank you so much. This has been just phenomenal, and thank you for giving us the opportunity to share and to get excited one more time for Equal Rights Amendment.
Thank you.
Yeah,
It's been wonderful. Thank you.
Please drive carefully.